Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome and bienvenue. This is Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz the Chanello.
This week, a national emergency. President Trump's latest bid to build that wall.
Also this week, the Democrats' Green New Deal, rampant socialism, or a whole lot of nothing.
And in the history department this week, the Ratfuckers of Ed Muskie.
You can't say Ratfuckers on the ABC.
That's what they call themselves. They're called the Ratfuckers. It's history, Chaz.
Fine. Well, in that case, read the Ratfuckers news.
With the clock ticking down to another government shutdown this weekend, congressional leaders have been putting together spending bills to keep things up and running until September. The major hurdle remained the president's demand for $5.7 billion in funding for a border wall. A veto-proof majority of Democrats and Republicans were on board with the bill, which includes $1.3 billion in funding for fences, not steel barriers or concrete walls, along a 90-kilometre stretch of border. The president wants a barrier along a stretch of 400 kilometres, so he wasn't well pleased.
Not happy about it. It's not doing the trick.
However,
I don't think you're going to see a shutdown. I wouldn't want to go to it now. If you did have it, it's the Democrats' fault.
turns out the president has a plan B. Sign the bill and at the same time declare a national emergency on the border. Although exactly what that will mean remains a little unclear. Under the National Emergency Act, the president can access a pot of around $10 billion earmarked for military construction projects. The president may also use unspent money already appropriated for disaster relief efforts, such as in Puerto Rico. But the Justice Department has warned an emergency order will get delayed, if not blocked altogether in the courts. And some legal experts, Chaz, are saying this could be an impeachable offence.
Impeachable sounds a bit of a stretch to me, but then again, a national emergency sounds a bit of a stretch to me as well. Remember, apprehensions on the southern border are a quarter of what they used to be. So where's the emergency there? And if it's such an emergency, why didn't Trump declare it months ago rather than messing around with a shutdown? Also, if there was an emergency, you'd do more than build a wall, because walls take a little bit of time. For example, in October last year, they completed a 2-mile stretch of steel slat and concrete wall. It had been planned since 2009, and it still took 8 months to finish after the contract was awarded. 2 miles! But anyway, I'll leave that for the courts to sort it out. As far as politics goes, it's all about the tiresome jockeying to claim victory. The left has been keen to point out that a year ago, Chuck Schumer offered $25 billion for the wall in return for a permanent fix for the Dreamers. Trump refused. Then in December, Trump asked for $5 billion for his wall, and Schumer offered him $1.6 billion for general border security. We had a shutdown. And now, Trump has accepted less than he was offered before the shutdown. So the Democrats are feeling pretty good about that. In fact, they say Trump lost even worse, because the money isn't even for walls, it's for fences.
It's not a wall. This is a barrier, these are fences.
Oh, except the fences look something like this. That is a wall, and it's $1.3 billion more wall than Pelosi said she'd fund.
Well, look, I don't know whether, Chaz, that should be called a wall or a fence or a barrier, but that is called a ladder. And that is called a tunnel, and those are balloons.
That's just the movie Up. But I do take your point. The whole wall debate is a bit of a sideshow, and it's never more of a sideshow than on Twitter. Now, you might have seen this tweet.
Gallup Poll, open borders will potentially attract 42 million Latin Americans. This will be a disaster for the U.S. We need the wall now.
Indeed. Well, look, this was based on this piece here, which, even though it looks very official on Gallup's website, is actually just the personal blog of the Gallup chairman. So it's really just a fancy version of this. But anyway, this is what his blog says. He writes that Gallup polled every country in Latin America and asked them if they would like to move to another country permanently if they could. And 27% of them said yes. And out of those people, 35% of them wanted to go to the United States. So, by Gallup's maths, that means 42 million people wanted to come to America. And even scarier, a full 5 million of those said that they're planning to move in the next 12 months, which led to restrained coverage like this.
5 million Latin Americans coming to US in next 12 months.
And of course, this.
Open borders will potentially attract 42 million Latin Americans.
Yeah, well, let's look at that claim, shall we? Let's look a bit more carefully. When the real Gallup wrote this poll up, they explicitly said that most people who say they want to migrate will never actually try to. Fewer of them will make plans to move, and even fewer still will actively prepare to move. And then they gave the example of Honduras, where 47% of the people say that they'd like to move to another country permanently if they could, but only 2% of them are actively preparing to do so. And by the way, this survey didn't ask these people if they were prepared to migrate illegally, which is no small thing. But if this Breitbart headline here was actually accurate, it would probably say something like this.
220,000 Latin Americans hoping to migrate to US in next 12 months, some of whom may migrate illegally.
Better. But I probably shouldn't be quite so sceptical. After all, these people did tell Gallup that they wanted to permanently move to America if they could. Although, that's just half the story. We know how many are coming in.
42 million.
But how many are going out? I know who can find out for us. Gallup! Turns out they also asked Americans whether they would like to permanently move to another country if they could, and 16% of them said yes. So let's see. America's got 325 million people, multiply that by 16%, and you get 52 million people! How's America going to replace 52 million people?
Open borders will potentially attract 42 million Latin Americans.
Great call, Mr. President. You've done it again.
Former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort's plea deal with special counsel Robert Mueller was tossed out by a federal court this week after a judge found Manafort had lied to the FBI, a grand jury and the Office of the Special Counsel. Judge Amy Berman Jackson ruled that Manafort lied after agreeing to cooperate with Mueller. His lies centre around dealings with an associate, Konstantin Kilimnik, who the FBI says has ties to Russian intelligence and pro-Russian Ukrainian politicians. The alleged lies surrounded a meeting in early August 2016 at a New York cigar lounge between Manafort, fellow Trump advisor Rick Gates, and Kilimnik. Manafort allegedly shared Trump campaign polling data with Kilimnik at a time when Russia, of course, was known to have hacked the Democratic Party, and as a candidate, Donald Trump had been publicly inviting Russia to look for Hillary Clinton's emails. Paul Manafort is due to be sentenced next month. And the question, of course, remains unanswered in all of this. Why did Manafort lie to investigators over this meeting and so much more?
That would be because he's dodgy.
It could well be as simple as that. Meanwhile, should mention as well, the Senate voted earlier today to confirm Bill Barr as Attorney General of the United States. He replaces Jeff Sessions. Barr also served as AG under the first President Bush. He now takes over at the Justice Department and has oversight of the Mueller investigation, and some are hoping he's going to shut it down.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
And Chaz, it was another big week in American presidential politics. It was minus 9 degrees Celsius and the snow was coming down, but Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar decided they were perfect conditions to
announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
And here's what you need to know about Amy Klobuchar. She's the 58-year-old Democratic senator from Midwestern Minnesota. She's in her third term after a career as a lawyer and county attorney. That means that she was in charge of criminal prosecutions, like her rival Kamala Harris of California, and that could certainly come up in the months ahead. Klobuchar was reportedly on Obama's shortlist for both Attorney General and the US Supreme Court. She is considered a more centrist candidate and has a record as a pragmatist in Washington, D.C. who likes to get things done. After the announcement, President Trump took this jab.
Well, it happened again. Amy Klobuchar announced that she's running for president, talking proudly of fighting global warming while standing in a virtual blizzard of snow, ice, and freezing temperatures. Bad timing. By the end of her speech, she looked like a snowman. Woman.
And Klobuchar jabbed right back on Good Morning America.
When he called me a snow woman, I'd like to see how his hair would fare in a blizzard.
But what about those reports last week that her staff think she's a terrible boss?
I am tough. I push people, that is true. But my point is that I have high expectations for myself. I have high expectations for the people that work for me, and I have high expectations for this country.
Yeah, there's a pretty funny rumour out there about that.
Really?
Yeah, suggesting that Amy Klobuchar once made a staffer shave her legs for her. And that rumour was so widespread, seriously, they even used it on the comedy Veep.
Mentioned in this book until page 134. I once dry shaved that woman's legs under her desk during a cabinet meeting.
That was based on the Klobuchar rumour. Now look, there's no evidence that rumour is true, of course, unfortunately. But what is true is Klobuchar's reputation for bipartisanship. Like you said, she's gotten 24 bills signed under Trump already. Even her favourite issues are kind of bipartisan. Her pet issues are mergers, privacy, and the overreach of social media companies. So she may not be Facebook's favourite candidate.
Well, meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren also made it official this week.
I am a candidate for President of the United States of America.
Better weather in Lawrence, Massachusetts at least. Warren's pitch: she understands the reasons for inequality in America and she knows how to fix a rigged system.
The middle class squeeze is real and millions of families can barely breathe. It is not right.
And here's what you need to know about Elizabeth Warren. She's the 69-year-old second-term Democratic senator from the state of Massachusetts. If elected president, she would be a year older than the previous oldest ever first-term president, one Donald J. Trump. Warren is a former law professor at Harvard, among other places, specialising in bankruptcy law. She helped to set up the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, but Republicans blocked her appointment to head it up, so she ran for the Senate instead. For decades, she's identified with her Native American heritage, but has been ridiculed by the president for doing so. And he did it again this week.
Today, Elizabeth Warren, sometimes referred to by me as Pocahontas, joined the race for president. Will she run as the first Native American presidential candidate, or has she decided that after 32 years, this is not playing so well anymore? See you on the campaign trail, Liz.
And that capitalised trail in the tweet there triggered allegations of racism against the president. Was it a reference to the so-called Trail of Tears, the forced removal of native tribes in the 1830s that ended up in a virtual genocide? Or was it just some gag about Western movies?
Well, I've hit my Trump tweet limit for the day, so moving right on. Elizabeth Warren is clearly the most policy-focused of all the Democrats. She's already announced the most cut-through policy of the campaign so far, a 2% wealth tax for people with more than $50 million and a 3% wealth tax for those with more than $1 billion. And that, by the way, is every single year they pay that, so that's a lot of money. Well, that hit the mark because Warren's wealth tax receives 61% approval overall. And get this, 50% approval amongst Republicans. Tell you who doesn't like it though.
Tell me.
Rich guys.
Sure.
Vox asked Wall Street traders whether they preferred Warren or Trump. And even Democrat Wall Street traders were saying things like, there are numerous people who I speak to who can't stand Donald Trump and are eager to vote for a Democrat, but who would nevertheless vote for Trump if it's a choice between him and Warren. She's the one person who is toxic for the business community. So there you go. She'd probably like that quote.
Yeah, she got on T-shirts already. Now, also this week, is he or isn't he? Former Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke looked an awful lot like a presidential candidate with a rally in El Paso, Texas, timed to coincide with a rally by President Trump just down the road.
We know that walls do not save lives. Walls end lives. We stand for America and we stand against walls.
And this was the president's response.
Young man who's got very little going for himself
except he's got a great first name. He challenged us. So we have, let's say, 35,000 people tonight, and he has 200 people, 300 people.
Now, the trouble is here that according to the El Paso Fire Department, Trump's venue only held 6,500 people, although there were a couple more thousand hanging around outside. And far from 200 or 300, Beto's crowd was, it seems, around about the same, maybe even bigger, 7,000 or 8,000, that according to reporters who were there.
Yeah, there were other estimates out there where they got about 13,000 people each. Either way, their crowds were pretty much the same.
Yep.
Anyway, two quickies. One, Michael Bloomberg has committed to spending $500 million in the election, whether he runs or not, and he may well spend more. That'll get us through the first few months, said his advisor. I'm not sure people dropping the best part of $1 billion into a campaign is a great development.
It's free speech.
Yeah.
Speech.
Look, it's better than this. The stupid coverage has already started. Kirsten Gillibrand was just trying to eat some fried chicken, and the New York Times jumped all over her on Twitter. Just stop it now, please. We've got 20 more months of this thing. Mercy!
Now to the so-called Green New Deal announced last week by Progressive Democrats, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Jeff Merkley. For supporters, it is a blueprint to combating both climate change and inequality. For Republicans and even some centrist Democrats, it is a socialist fever dream. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell even wants to force a vote in an effort to split the Democrats. And here's what the president thinks.
It sounds like a high school term paper that got a low mark.
Well, Trump's had his say. Now it's my turn. Climate change is happening. The warmest 5 years on record are the last 5 years. The loss of ice volume in Antarctica, it's accelerating. The number of billion-dollar climate-related disasters per year is increasing. Meanwhile, more Americans believe that climate change is happening. More Americans worry about climate change. More Americans think that climate change will pose a serious threat to them or their way of life in their lifetime. And more Americans say stricter environmental laws are worth the cost. In other words, this now is the perfect time to launch a super ambitious plan to address climate change. So, when the Green New Deal dropped last Thursday, it made a big splash. 6 presidential candidates immediately expressed support for it. It got huge media coverage, but then people noticed an FAQ that was released by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office at the same time as the congressional resolution was. And it had some interesting elements, like a weird bit about getting rid of farting cows and a bit about building out high-speed rail at a scale where air travel stops becoming necessary. Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono made the obvious point that that would be pretty hard for Hawaii. But leaving that aside, just this week, California massively scaled down their high-speed rail project after it blew out from being a $33 billion project to be completed next year to becoming a $77 billion project and maybe a $100 billion project to be completed in 2033. Now that's connecting 2 Californian cities. Multiply that by 5,000 airports. But that wasn't even the most controversial bit. The FAQ also promised economic security for all who are unable or unwilling to work. Unwilling to work? That, of course, immediately attracted a huge amount of attention and mockery, leading to the entire document being taken down from Ocasio-Cortez's website. It also led to this exchange between Tucker Carlson and an Ocasio-Cortez advisor.
Why would we ever pay people who are, quote, unwilling to work?
We never would, right? And AOC has never said anything like that, right? I think you're referring to some sort of document that some doctored document that somebody other than us has been circulating.
Oh, I thought that came right from her. That was in the background or from her office, is my understanding.
No.
Almost as ridiculous as the idea that we're going to build enough light rail to make airplanes unnecessary, which I think actually is from the plan.
I don't know where you got that either, Tucker.
Now, everything that spokesperson just said there was not true. But that didn't stop left-wing groups celebrating like he debunked all the conservative media lies. And it didn't stop Ocasio-Cortez retweeting those false claims, even though she must have known that the document did actually come from her office. It was in the news all day. They'd only just taken the document down. Now, the next day, this attempt to deny reality, that became the news. And so Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff tweeted out that an early draft of an FAQ that was clearly unfinished got published to the website by mistake. Fine. But if it was just an early unfinished draft that got published by mistake, then why did Ocasio-Cortez's staff email it directly to NPR? And why did they send it directly to the Washington Post in advance and then ask them to embargo it? And why, 9 days later, have they still not put out the finished version of their FAQ? And why did Ocasio-Cortez never either apologise or even clarify to her millions of followers that she just retweeted them claims that were not true? That was sloppy of her at best or dishonest at worst. But, bottom line, none of that stuff is in the Green New Deal resolution. So let's look at what is. The big news is that the Green New Deal aims to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions within 10 years, which is pretty ambitious given the IPCC's target isn't to reach net zero emissions until 2050. And a lot of climate scientists are pretty pessimistic about even hitting that target. So how do the Democrats plan to get there? Well, there isn't a lot of detail. No numbers, no plans, no choices. They just say, we'll do everything. We'll invest in technology, be energy efficient, build infrastructure, do research. The resolution might as well be this. But then it gets a bit weird with a sort of lefty wish list, about $50 trillion worth by some estimates. But I think the language they use in it is so vague, it could mean anything. Now, like, they do have a jobs guarantee there with adequate family and medical leave, and that would cost a lot, but it's also super popular. And that's when it gets vague. They'll strengthen unions somehow. They'll eliminate unfair competition, whatever that means. They'll provide high-quality healthcare. Note, they don't say Medicare for all. They don't even say public healthcare. That could mean anything. They'll provide economic security for all, which they probably think is a universal basic income, but that could just be welfare. They'll provide high-quality education, including higher education. Once again, who knows what that is. They'll provide affordable housing, which the government arguably already does with public housing, and they'll provide healthy and affordable food. Food stamps. Cool. So this resolution is basically an unrealistically ambitious target stuffed with vague motherhood statements that have all been overshadowed by a disastrous rollout. It's nothing to be scared of. And until we get more detail, I think Nancy Pelosi put it best just before it was released. The Green Dream, or whatever they call it, nobody knows what it is, but they're for it, right? I guess so.
Well, this is already the most diverse presidential field in history in terms of gender and ethnicity, at least on the Democratic side. But what are the implications of that? Elaine Kmark is a former senior policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore, and she's author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates. Elaine, welcome back to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
5 Democratic women who are currently in Congress are already off and running for president. That's never happened before. Why is it happening now?
Well, part of it is that there are at least 5 Democratic women senators. So traditionally, the pool for presidential candidates, or certainly for the most successful ones, have been the governors and the senators. Those are the highest ranking offices in the United States. And we have now, finally, women in the pipeline. So that's really what this is. I mean, you know, previously, for many, many decades, there were so few women who reached those top levels of American politics that there weren't many potential presidential candidates. This time we have a lot of women senators, and one of the things you'll notice is that all of them are relatively young or in the age group where they've got enough energy to run for president.
And they're getting in early. Is that significant that more women are declaring now and some of the potential male candidates are standing by?
Well, I think the women are very committed to doing this race, and that shows in their early entrance, in forming the committees early, starting to raise money early. I suspect that some of them are worried about raising the right amount of money, although we have a candidate from New York and a candidate from California, so they should have pretty solid financial bases. But I think that the women are, I think it's really a sign of their commitment and their energy, and frankly, the fact that in the midterm elections in 2018, one of the things we saw in the Democratic Party was an enormous outpouring of voting and activism on the part of American women. So the Democratic Party is the party that women feel at home in.
You talked about the pipeline to the presidency. Is there, though, a Trump factor as well, or even a Hillary factor there?
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, not only do some women feel that Hillary got robbed, she did win the popular vote by 3 million votes and lost the Electoral College vote, but I think that the antipathy among a lot of American women towards President Trump is so intense that we saw a huge number, unprecedented number of women running for Congress in 2018. We saw an unprecedented number of women voting for Democratic candidates. And I think it's reflected also that that energy is continuing into the presidential race.
Does the gender and racial diversity in this particular Democratic field tend to dilute those as electoral advantages?
Well, you know, it's in a very big primary field, right? What everybody has to try to figure out is what is their niche? What is it that can get them the most votes, the most momentum to accumulate the delegates needed to nominate it at a convention? And, you know, so far it looks like the niche might even go to the white man in the race. So it's always a question of niche. Being a female candidate for president is obviously not going to be a niche in the 2020 Democratic primaries.
So who would you say is out of the gates best at this stage with the rollout and the early appearances in places like Iowa and New Hampshire?
Well, you know, the early chatter is that the women senators have basically done a good job on their rollouts. Elizabeth Warren is under attack always from President Trump about her claim of Indian American heritage, which didn't quite pan out. So she's taken a lot of heat for that. But she has quite an energetic base and she has quite a national following. I think Kamala Harris had a almost perfect rollout. I think Amy Klobuchar had a very strong rollout. I think the only one of the 6 women, the 5 female senators did pretty well. The one member of Congress, Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, really had a very weak rollout, kind of confused, chaotic, etc. And on the other hand, being a congresswoman and being from a small state, I think she has to be looked at as a long shot in any event. But certainly the weak rollout didn't help her.
So are these candidates at any kind of an advantage getting in 5 months before the debates start, 12 months before the caucuses and primaries are on?
Oh, not particularly. I mean, I think that there's a couple months at the beginning of this year when people can get in without hurting themselves. By the spring, however, certainly by late spring, you pretty much have to be in this race in order to do 2 important things. One is to raise a sufficient amount of money to take you through a long race. And the second is that in those 2 early states, Iowa and New Hampshire, the voters actually expect to meet you. They expect to meet you in person. They expect to talk to you, get a feel for you. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of trips and a lot of meetings. And you can't just get in, you know, in December and expect to win the Iowa caucuses or the New Hampshire primary.
Elaine, on the policy front, most of the candidates are signing up to this Green New Deal, at least in theory, and also to the idea of Medicare for all. Is there a danger that the party could be drawn into a very left-wing primary?
Well, more important than the issues in this primary is the importance Democrats feel to beat Donald Trump. And that will be a mitigating factor in primary voters' actions. They're going to look who can beat Trump. And I think issues will be less important. And some of the candidates have already seen how getting out there too far to the left has gotten them in trouble. If you talk about Medicare for all and you also talk about prohibiting private health insurance in the United States, you're going to have a lot of people really mad at you. And I think that we saw with Kamala Harris, she got out a little too far on that. And the Green New Deal sounds great, but you know, getting rid of not using fossil fuels in 10 years to get rid of fossil fuels, nobody thinks that's realistic. So as some of these ideas get thrown out there, what's going to happen is they will be pulled back a little bit to the center, because it will be clear that A, some of them are unrealistic, and B, that they would be hurtful in a general election.
Now, I know it is very early, but how confident do you think Democrats can afford to be about their prospects of winning the presidency next year?
I think Democrats can be cautiously optimistic. Democrats had a very good midterm. There's been lots of enthusiasm and interest in the candidates. But most importantly, almost 2/3 of the public says that they absolutely do not want to see Donald Trump reelected. And those are numbers we have never seen for a sitting president. So it's less the Democratic strength, which has been shown, but the absolute desire on the part of many Americans to not have Donald Trump be president in 2021. And I think that's probably the most interesting number to watch is his weakness. His weakness has even led people, Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, presidential candidate, said the other day, well, if we run against Donald Trump. And I think there's a lot of questions to whether or not he will even be running in 2020.
Elaine, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
The Republican majority Senate Rules Committee voted this week to make a procedural change which would fast-track the confirmation process for a whole host of presidential nominees. This move would cut debate on most nominations to positions, including the District Court, from 30 hours to just 2, but it would not apply to Cabinet or Supreme Court nominees. Ranking Committee Democrat and presidential wannabe Amy Klobuchar has rejected the proposal, saying it would make it easier for the Senate to confirm unqualified nominees. Perish the thought, Chaz.
Indeed. Of course, if the Republicans want to make that rule change, they can just do it with 51 votes.
Right. Just
like they did when they got rid of the Supreme Court filibuster. So who cares what Klobuchar thinks anyway? And Republicans are arguing that they should make the change because during Trump's first 2 years, they had to face 168 of these extended debates because of the obstructionist Democrats, which is a point that would be more convincing if the Republicans hadn't themselves created 218 of these extended debates during 2013 to 14 under Obama. But anyway, they aren't the only ones worried about confirmations. So let's go to the wall.
Big, beautiful wall.
Now you might remember this from the State of the Union last week.
This new era of cooperation can start with finally confirming the more than 300 highly qualified nominees who are still stuck in the Senate, in some cases years and years waiting. Not right.
And yes, out of 706 key Senate-confirmed White House appointments, 275 of them are indeed yet to be confirmed. But one way Trump might be able to address that is to nominate people for 149 of those positions. And by the way, out of those 126 nominees who are waiting, none of them have been waiting years and years. Trump has barely been president for years. Most of them were nominated in the back half of 2018. Although the ambassador for the Bahamas has been waiting for confirmation since May 2017. So it's no wonder that whole country's gone to pot. By the way, Trump's lack of nominations is particularly hitting the Justice Department and Interior Department. Only 41% of their key positions have been filled, and neither of them have many nominees waiting in the wings either. Obviously, this has all been exacerbated as well by Trump's sackings. This is Trump's turnover of his senior advisors during his first 2 years. That's actually a higher turnover rate than George W. Bush had in his entire 8 years. And Obama ended up slightly more on 71% after his 8 years. And this goes all the way to the top. There are no less than 4 agency heads currently missing, and they've been replaced by acting agency heads. In fact, Trump is the first president ever to leave the Defense Department without a confirmed secretary, just because the White House hasn't nominated one. Mind you, there is a reason for this.
I like acting because I can move so quickly. It gives me more flexibility.
Flexibility? How much more flexibility is the guy who can dance like this need? By the way, I can't believe this footage is 4 years old, and this is the first time that we've used it. I mean, look at this goal. Anyway, Trump flat out said that he was going to do this back in 2017 when he said, we don't want to fill all the vacancies. We won't fill all the vacancies. We don't need so many of these people. Okay, fine. Look, it might work. After all, Republicans like a small public service. This is a democracy, this is how it works. So try it out for 4 to 8 years. Let's see what happens. But maybe then don't blame the Senate for your decisions. You happy with that? He's happy.
Well, it's time now for a look at another historic presidential campaign, one where a sitting president used dirty tricks to win, but sowed the seeds of his own demise.
Nixon now, Nixon now.
Heading into his 1972 re-election campaign, America's 37th president, Richard Milhous Nixon, had a problem.
I pledge to you, we shall have an honourable end to the war in Vietnam.
Nixon was elected in 1968 on a promise to bring peace, but the war was dragging on and the US economy was ailing. Unemployment and inflation had climbed to 6%. Nixon's approval rating was sliding into the danger zone, 49%. The president was vulnerable. The rival Nixon feared most was Senator Edward Kennedy, but his involvement in the death of a young woman in a 1969 accident made a third Kennedy presidential campaign less likely.
I was overcome, I'm frank to say, by a jumble of emotions: grief, fear, doubt, exhaustion, panic, confusion.
Nixon's next most likely opponent was Senator Edmund Muskie, the man from Maine, who was the Democrats' vice presidential nominee in 1968. Polls in 1971 found the stern, Lincoln-esque Muskie was the only Democrat beating Nixon.
The decision to run for the presidency has not been an easy one. It will deeply change my life, and it will affect the members of my family for the rest of their lives.
Prophetic words, as we'll soon see. The Nixon White House formed the Committee to Re-elect the President. It included a group which called itself the Ratfuckers. Headed by a Nixon aide named Dwight Chapin and his old college buddy Donald Segretti, they used some pretty undergraduate tactics to great effect, creating chaos during the Democratic primary. Their pranks included cancelling early morning wake-up calls so campaign reporters missed buses and planes, planting protesters at rival candidate events, and cancelling venues booked for rallies. And then there were the letters. Stolen letterhead was used to write to voters claiming Muskie's Democrat rival Henry Jackson had fathered an illegitimate daughter in 1929 and, confusingly, was also a homosexual. In an echo of the Chappaquiddick incident, the forged Muskie letter also claimed another rival, Hubert Humphrey, had been arrested for drunk driving in 1967 with a prostitute in his car. But the fake letter that really changed the election was sent to the editor of New Hampshire's union leader. He claimed that Muskie laughed when a staff member used the derogatory phrase Canuck to mock Americans of French-Canadian descent. They were a big voting bloc in New Hampshire. The next day, the paper published a report based on rumours that Muskie's wife Jane was a heavy drinker who swore in front of reporters. Just days before the New Hampshire primary, Muskie mounted a flatbed truck in front of the newspaper office and in driving snow condemned the paper's publisher, William Loeb.
By attacking me, by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward.
Muskie certainly looked emotional. His voice broke and seized up, but was it the cold? Was it anger, as Muskie said? Or was it, as David Broder of the Washington Post reported, that Muskie was crying with tears streaming down his face? Reporters debated whether there were tears on Muskie's cheeks or maybe it was melting snow. Either way, he looked like a candidate losing control of his emotions and his campaign. Muskie still won the New Hampshire primary, but his 30-point lead in opinion polls was cut to less than 10 points by George McGovern. The following months saw McGovern become the new frontrunner with wins in Wisconsin and Massachusetts.
We have won a great victory today. There's no question about that.
A long, bitter primary continued, but Muskie was done. McGovern offered him the vice presidential nomination, but Muskie turned him down.
It has been a heavy emotional drain, and especially for Mrs. Muskie, as well as the children.
It wasn't until after Nixon beat McGovern in November 1972 that the full extent of the Dirty Tricks campaign came to light during the investigation into Watergate, the committee's biggest dirty trick of all. More than 50 Nixon operatives had been working to damage Muskie and the Democrats. Donald Segretti admitted he was the one that forged the Muskie letter.
I would like to make clear that this letter was my idea and was not suggested by any other person.
Segretti went to jail. In all, 40 Nixon officials were indicted or locked up. President Nixon himself was forced to resign in August 1974 to avoid impeachment. Another of the Ratfuckers had gone to New Hampshire as well and donated to the campaign of Nixon's Republican rival, Pete McCluskey, allegedly on behalf of the Young Socialist Alliance. He then sent the receipt to the union leader, who published it, damaging McCluskey's campaign. That Ratfucker's name? Roger Stone. And next week, Chaz, we're going to have a look at the historic 2004 Howard Dean presidential campaign. And we'll have a very special guest to talk to us about Howard Dean.
Dennis Kucinich.
Somebody who knows Howard Dean very well, but I can't
Hillary
say
Clinton.
too much though, because Howard Dean might not show up. And that is all the time we have for another trip to Planet America.
Look for the updates on Facebook. During the week, there is the address. And by the way, the House voted to get out of the war in Yemen yesterday, so now it's back to the Senate. Squeeze it in.
Yeah, well done you. Bye-bye.